There we are. Bang, 7. Let me catch my time zones again. Very, very excited for this evening's event. We have Robyn Cunneen and her presentation. But before we run into that and her biography and who she is, I just want to introduce the Irish Deaf Research Network for those who maybe don't know, and just let you know some housekeeping, particularly around tech and Zoom etiquette. So this event is organised by the Irish Deaf Research Network, which we fondly refer to as the IDRN. Really, it's any academic work done in the Irish deaf community, and any relevant topics are brought together. So these topics can be from a linguistic perspective, sociological, legal, whatever the case may be. And as a network of academics, we work together and we have an email list if you want to have more information on events that we do. So this seminar is part of our work that we do throughout the year. We also host conferences. Forgive me 1 second. Just getting a few pop-ups on my screen. There we go. So really, I want to thank TU Dublin and the Irish Deaf Society for being willing to cover the expenses of the sign language interpreters for tonight's seminar. This ensures free accessibility for everyone who's attending, so we're very, very grateful to our two sponsors. Thank you so much. On to the technical housekeeping and Zoom etiquette. For this presentation, for you to know, it will be recorded and be made available on YouTube after the fact. So if you want to re-watch or recommend it to a friend or colleague, you will be able to do so, and it will be, as I mentioned, available on our YouTube channel. When the presentation is over, we will stop recording because that's when we will have a Q&A, questions and answer, for approximately 30 minutes. That is what we have budgeted for the Q&A. Once the presentation is over and you want to ask a question, you can either use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can type into the chat that you would like to make your intervention. If you're having any issues with Zoom, please bear in mind it's not our responsibility. Only if all participants are experiencing the same technical issue, then of course that's something we're responsible for. But if it's an individual technical issue, we are not responsible. So, with housekeeping aside, I would now like to warmly welcome Robyn Cunneen, and if I could get her spotlit so we could see her on camera as well, that would be amazing. So Robyn Cunneen works at the Irish Deaf Society as Research and Policy Officer. Whilst working, she is also undertaking a PhD, so two major roles as an individual. And as you can imagine, there's crossover between her work in IDS and her PhD. Her research as a research and policy officer, she was responsible for providing policy positions for deaf people, and she's also research and policy development to and making requesting funding from departments within the government, particularly research that she's doing for this is the Irish Deaf Society, Irish Research Council, and UL AHSS. So today's presentation is a corpus-based critical discourse analysis of language ideologies in parliamentary debates about recognition of sign language, which comes very timely given that we've had British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language recognised by Stormont just on Tuesday past. So I think for you to be here at this time is perfect. It's kismet nearly. But I won't take too much of your time, Robyn, please. I'm very excited to see your presentation, so I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Nora, and thank you to the IDRN for inviting me to present here this evening, and thank you to everybody who is watching. I know it is 7 o'clock, and I hope that this will be an enjoyable presentation for you. So, as Nora said, I am the Research and Policy Officer at the Irish Deaf Society, and I'm also undertaking a PhD at the University of Limerick. My PhD will be presented in part this evening. I'm going to focus on one of the chapters, and my PhD is supervised by Dr. Maria Hickey. I have another supervisor, Dr. Andrew Shorten, and another supervisor, Dr. John Bosco Conema. So I'm very grateful to the support of my supervisors as well. And I'd like to acknowledge the support that IDS, UL and the Irish Research Council have given me throughout this work. I'm very grateful to them. So moving on. So Nora did give the title of my presentation, but I think I'd like to focus on what it's actually about. So it's based on an article that I co-wrote with one of my supervisors, and it's about the debates on ISL recognition. We would have followed those debates from 2013 to 2020, and the debates on ISL recognition and how legislators or policymakers talk about ISL and what they believe about ISL. So I don't need to give too much context to this group, but the context is ISL was officially recognised through the ISL Act in 2017, but prior to that there were two bills, the Recognition of Irish Sign Language for the Deaf Community Bill 2013 and 2016. So plenty of debates there. So what this particular piece of research did was it examined beliefs about ISL. Now, there are beliefs about all languages, and we call that language ideology. So I'll probably use that phrase again throughout this presentation, but is essentially what we believe about language. And that can be across a lot of domains. It can be in its use, or its value, or its perceived value, I should say. But I'm specifically looking at the parliamentary debates. So why would we do that? Why do we look, or why bother look at something like this? So it has already been established that what people believe about language, or should I say, what powerful people believe about language, such as legislators in government who have the power to make laws, what they believe about language can influence the types of rights that will be afforded. So it is really important. So the aims were to look at the beliefs about ISL in the parliamentary debates, to look at how these beliefs are part of the arguments for ISL recognition. And in that, we'll be able to understand what the perspectives on ISL are. And we're looking at ISL here as a language, and we'll see when we go through the findings what exactly I mean by that. I'm going to jump straight to the conclusion first by telling you that, according to the parliamentary debates, there is an understanding of deaf people as members of a distinct cultural group with their own language. And I put real in brackets because that is the word that was used by legislators. I know we wouldn't probably say that. We wouldn't feel the need to. But you'll see through examples later on the use of this word, so that there is a link between language, culture, and identity. So I'm going to go through some theories and concepts first. So I've talked briefly about language ideology. So it can be beliefs, assumptions, or ideas that people have about language. And it can be about the status of a language. So the case of ISL, it can be about the use of a language, where it should be used, how it should be used, the value of that. It could be to do with the prestige or the worth of a language. And in terms of majority languages, for example, English, there are very rarely debates about whether English, for example, is a real language, but minority languages or sign languages, there can be. So there are 5 types, broadly speaking, of ideologies that relate to sign languages. So the first talks about the value. So this idea that sign languages, they're not real, they have less value than spoken languages. We call that devaluating. So it takes down the value of the language. Then there is audism. So this is discrimination based on the ability to hear. Then there is this sort of debate about whether deaf people can be perceived as a linguistic minority or people with a disability, and oftentimes it can be both. Then there is cost. So this is called the economic paradigm. So this would, for example, would say something like, it's too expensive to provide interpreters. Okay, that's one type of ideology. And then there is deaf gain. So this is an interesting concept where it means that when people are deaf, they bring unique strengths and perspectives and ways of communicating that provide some benefit to themselves and to others. So there are 5 broad types of ideologies about sign languages. Now, another concept I want to talk about is language legitimacy. This basically is about languages being real. So is this language real? Is it legitimate? And the author that talks about this concept describes it as some languages are seen as superior to others and some are seen as inferior, or not working properly, things like that, not capable of expressing certain emotions or ideas, that they're not complex. And there's also the notion of compensatory tool, which John Bosco Conema talks about. And this was, I suppose, could be what is oftentimes still believed to be the case about ISL even, is that it is a tool rather than a language. And you would often see that in documents, government documents or policy documents. And really, again, it's about questioning whether sign languages are languages to the same extent as spoken languages. And if the languages aren't viewed as the same as spoken languages, then there is the worry that the community wouldn't be recognised as a minority either. So that is the concept of language legitimacy. And again, you have to bear in mind that majority languages are not talked about in this regard. So I'm going to talk a little bit about another concept, and this relates to how I did the research. So I took an approach that analysed text, and it's called critical discourse analysis. And it simply is a way of analysing text for nearly hidden meanings. So not just the black and white on a page. So it helps us to look for other things that might be there. So, for example, is there power being exercised, or are we able to tell what someone's belief is based on this text? And there are many different types of discourse analysis, but the type that I chose is to do with the connection between language that we use, the way we think, and the society we live in, and how they're all connected. So if I just return to what discourse means, discourse is simply just a piece of text, but it's also the context that comes with it. So if you take, for example, media discourse can be the news articles, YouTube even, social media, and it's inherently very powerful. It's very powerful because it's so widespread. And the people that are in the media can often be very powerful individuals. So if you take, for example, the way Irish travellers or immigrants, refugees, if you look at that for an example, and the way they are talked about in the media is often very negative, that can have an effect on wider society and what we believe about those groups. So it's really about the language we use, how it is interpreted in society, and what that makes us believe then. So that's really that triangle: language, how we think, the society that we're in are all connected. So if you take, for example, the case of ISL recognition, so politicians or legislators are powerful people by their job. What they say about ISL and the deaf community can spread to society, and they probably will be believed. And again, what society say can have an influence on what they will argue for. So their beliefs about ISL will have an impact on a deaf person's experience. In this case, the types of rights that were decided upon. So to give you an idea of what I was working with, I collected the parliamentary debates on ISL recognition from 2013 to 2020. And these were Shanid and Dáil debates on ISL recognition. And it was about 100,000 words in total. So I just collected them all from the Oireachtas website. And then I used a software, and I always describe this software as like a digital way of highlighting. So instead of printing out all of the text and getting all the different color highlighters and, you know, highlighting different things in different colors, I simply just used a piece of software to do that. So really what I was looking for was beliefs about ISL as a language, beliefs about the deaf community, and what were the arguments? How did they justify ISL recognition? So, when I was using the highlighters, what did I actually highlight? So I was looking for any of these 5 types of ideologies. So you would call it coding. I was highlighting them, I was coding them in the document. What I was also doing was I was looking for strategies. So what strategies did they use to justify ISL recognition? And when you do the 2 of these together, you can see the argument and the beliefs behind the argument. So, for example, they could say ISL should be recognised because the Irish Constitution says so. So because some higher authority says so, because it's about respect, dignity, identity, so there's morals there, excuse me, or because there are 5,000 deaf people in Ireland. Okay, that's a big number. So there's a logical reason. And there's the use of storytelling. So I'll get onto that one a bit later. You're going to have to excuse me because I'm struggling with a bit of a cough and a sore throat today, but I'll do my best. So the first finding is that ISL is a linguistic and cultural minority. So that's the first finding. And they actually use this word indigenous. So an indigenous language of the deaf community. Now this is interesting because if we look at the word indigenous, you will see that it is any language that is native to a particular area, spoken by minorities, small-scale groups. And that indigenous people have their own languages, cultures, you know, social and political groups that vary from those of mainstream society. So they were using the word indigenous to try to show us what they believe about ISL. But it's interesting because they didn't actually end up using the word indigenous in the Act. So let's look at what the Act says. So the state recognises the right of ISL users to use ISL as their native language. And then, if we just jump down to number 2, the community of persons using Irish Sign Language shall have the right to use, develop and preserve. So it does correlate in a way to the level of indigenous, but they did not choose that word in the Act. So I would wonder about that gap there. They also removed the right to deaf culture. Now, Comparing deaf communities to other Indigenous groups can be positive because it can help people to understand the notion of deaf culture by comparing to others. And we're going to see this use of comparison now in the upcoming point. So the second finding under this is this comparison to Irish. So this is quite interesting because, you know, nobody argues that Irish is a real language. You know, nobody argues that. Yet now, or I should say then, still recently in 2013 all the way up to 2020, then they are comparing to the Irish language. They want to elevate ISL to that status. However, it doesn't come without warning. So they talk about, even though Irish is recognised as the first official in the Constitution, there are a lack of resources allocated to it and a lack of follow-through. So that's what they're saying is that just because something has this high level of recognition doesn't necessarily mean that it makes the situation any better. So these are quotes. So it is one of our two Indigenous languages, with the other, Gaeilge, being our first official. So again, it's talking about likening it to Irish being Indigenous. However, the state has failed the Irish language. There are no legal obligations on private companies to use Irish. The same could happen with ISL. So they're warning. And again, recognition as an official language does not necessarily mean the resources are provided. So they acknowledge that ISL could be recognised at the same level, but that does not necessarily mean that the situation will improve. Interestingly, the third point under this is about what ISL can do. Now, again, I return to this point about, you know, those that are familiar with this, we probably wouldn't describe it like this because, you know, if you're using ISL every day, you may not contemplate that it's real for a second, but the policymakers did. They did talk about what they think ISL can do, that it's a rich and capable language. So they talk about ISL as real. They have conversations with each other about the legitimacy, again, going back to the legitimacy of ISL. And it's nearly like they are convincing one another that, yes, this is a legitimate thing. So in a more official capacity, they changed means of communication to language in the ISL Act. So that is quite profound, actually. And then one of the quotes from the legislators was, when one says means of communication, one is reducing its status. Language is 100% right. So there's this idea by an author of this imaginary hierarchy of languages. So if you imagine the triangle, that sign languages are typically at the bottom of this triangle. But this argument where they're talking about that ISL is a real language and everything that it can do, which I will go on to in the next slide, moves it up in that hierarchy. So they're trying to tell us that they believe ISL should be higher, likened to other languages. So just a bit more on being a rich and capable language. They say it is capable of expressing every kind of concept. They talk about the structure of ISL and how it can be different around the country. They talk about it being a visual language, so a language of the face, hands, body. They're proclaiming what they know about ISL. So they say, even in Ireland, we change the language depending on what county we are in the sense that we have our own accents. The same beautiful expression must be there for people who are deaf. So again, they're comparing to Irish, but they're trying to make it relatable. they're trying to justify that ISL is a language. It is exactly like English or Irish. It has the same traits, so it should be recognised. So again, the beliefs are part of the strategies to justify the recognition. So more on this then, the strategies. So ISL should be recognised because, so far we've seen things that sound like values. So that's identity, respect, probably dignity and inclusion. And these, it's to do with morals. But excuse me, how do I know, as the researcher, for example, how do I know that these are values? Well, I'm aware of the social and historical context of ISL recognition in relation to oppression and discrimination. So I'm able to recognize those. So part of analysing a text critically in this way is your own position, that you have to be aware of the context and the history behind it. So in another way, the data so far has said ISL should be recognised because the state has a duty, or the constitution says so, because other languages are recognised. So there's a comparison there to other languages, and experts said that it should be recognised. So there is a strategy there where they draw on experts. So there was IDS colleagues involved, there was research referenced, there was other case studies of other cases of sign language recognition. So that is another strategy that was used, and we can see the kind of beliefs that are embedded in those. So moving on to the second set of findings is related to deaf gain. So I'm going to talk about deaf gain again as a concept. This is quite interesting, and it was interesting for this finding to come through, because while the legislators were speaking about benefits, I did find that there was an unequal balance between talking about how wider society would benefit versus how deaf people themselves will benefit. So just to go back to that concept of deaf gain, so it's about deaf people having unique strengths, perspectives, and ways of communicating that benefit everyone and themselves. So for example, these are just examples, so strong visual communication skills and different ways of thinking, different perspectives to offer that a hearing person wouldn't have. So what are the benefits that they talk about in the debates? They talk about personal benefits, they talk about benefits to society, and even business benefits. So some of the legislators either had a business themselves or knew somebody that had a business and were actually talking about it in that sense. I'll get onto an example now in a second. But I noticed in the data a noticeable lack of focus on how deaf people themselves will benefit, which is very interesting. And I'll show you examples. So the cultural impact of the passing of this legislation will be profound. So specifically the impact on public bodies and institutions. And then another one said, when we recognise ISL, our whole culture and society will be deepened. And another one said, the more languages we have, the better. So while it's very positive, it talks about diversity and enhancing diversity, there was actually a noticeable gap on the other side of that, where there was a sort of imbalance as to talking about how deaf people themselves will benefit. And then I mentioned this briefly when I was talking about strategies, but storytelling as a strategy. So there was quite a lot of storytelling, and I've just given two examples here. And what's interesting is that At the start of the debates, more so in 2013 and 2014, storytelling was huge in the debates. And they started off being personal examples. And then as the years went on, the stories changed to more about society again. So one person talked about how they employed quite a number of tailors. A significant number of them were people from the deaf community. They learned some sign, and they were enriched by that. So that's a very positive personal experience. But they would use that strategy of storytelling to illustrate why they think ISL should be recognised and the benefit that it will bring. And then another one was that a person knew a local doctor who many deaf and hard of hearing people would attend. And it's because that doctor, now I'm not sure of the exact context of this, but had some sign or had sign, again, would communicate with patients through sign language or finger spelling. That's what they're saying. So the idea being here that, the idea here being that deaf people would be inclined to go to this person instead of somebody else. So there was a wide variety of stories being told about the benefits of either encountering a deaf person or encountering ISL. And I argue that people telling these stories, they're trying to make the situation relatable to others. So yeah, relatable everyday events and activities that involved a deaf person or ISL that had positive outcomes. And that's the strategy, that ISL should be recognised because it would add value and diversity to society. So just on the conclusions now. So there's a couple. So policymakers believe, based on this analysis, that ISL is an important part of a deaf person's identity, linguistic and cultural identity. They make arguments about ISL being a real language that has a corresponding deaf culture, and that ISL should be recognised because Irish is, and that is the case because Irish is another minority language in the state, and they're trying to illustrate that they think ISL is another minority language in the state that should be recognised. And just what I've just spoke about, that I have noticed a gap. So benefits to society emphasised way more than the direct benefits to deaf people. And if we, I suppose, zoom out from this and we just put the debates to the side for a second, and I would come across a lot of policy documents in my work with IDS, and it's noticeable that the policy documents would tend to be more disability focused, despite the debates being language focused, which is interesting. So what does this actually mean? So recognition is achieved, but there may be barriers there with implementation. So I haven't investigated that, but that's my observation, is that while the beliefs are there seems to be an issue with implementation at policy level, that the same ideologies that were present in the debates can't or have not yet fully transferred over to policy. So that's my closing observation with this work. And thank you very much for listening. And I'd be very happy to take any questions or any comments at all.